All right, so I'm going to provide a general overlook of the Belle 2 computing, and then I'll focus a bit on some of the work that's being conducted in the US. So just as a quick overview for those that are unaware, so Belle 2 is an E+ E- collider that is really there to measure new phenomena, looking for things beyond the standard model. It's a rather large collaboration, about 725 plus physicists. The data rates are substantially bigger than anything that the previous B factories have created. So we're looking at about 50 times more data volume with 40 times larger data collision rates. P&L, as the lead lab, has contributed to the detector construction, and this is complete in at KK. This is actually the largest US scientific investment in Japan. And so there's a large list of people that are involved. At this point, the current status is that SuperKEK B, we've already tested it with beams going around this has already been done. This is phase 1, what we call phase 1, and this was done in 2016. We're currently in the phase of cosmic ray data taking. And finally, we anticipate taking some data for physics runs in 2018. So in terms of computing, what are the requirements? So we have a rate of about 6 kilohertz. This corresponds to 11 petabytes per year. And this is going to actually happen at the top of luminosity about 2022. We anticipate about 100 petabytes of raw data. And a total of about 200 to 300 petabytes of total data volume. We really have a similar model as the LHC experiments, where we have it's a distributed computing environment. So things are across Asia, North America, and Europe. We have a steering group that kind of provides the estimations of our resources. And then after that, we have scrutiny reviews, if you will, one being called the BPAC, and also DOE that reviews us to ensure that our estimations are online and consistent with what they've seen in other experiments. So what you see at the bottom right is effectively a schematic diagram of our computing model for the first 3 years. What you have is a detector at the top left of that diagram, and then you have the computing center at KK that receives all the raw data. Simultaneous, once that data arrives at KK, it gets transferred to PNNL. And then after that, both sites are actually in situ processing the data. Once the data is processed, it gets replicated across the world for physicists to do some analysis. So pretty atypical of what you would see from the LHC experiments. So we've done a lot of Monte Carlo runs to try to increase our scale and proof of concepts. So you can see at about 2013 is really what we classified as our first Monte Carlo campaign. Very, very small. It's a blip. And as we've moved on, as of about 2015, we are now at the point where we're managing close to 20,000 jobs concurrently. At the end of the day, what we really have to do is manage about an order of magnitude greater. So we're always trying to push the envelope and introduce new resources to be able to stress not only the WMS, but also the distributed management system. At this point, we've hit roughly 300 kilohertz specs for our highest benchmark in terms of compute resources. And so in the upcoming months, we're now in a Monte Carlo 9, and we're anticipating running significantly higher amounts of processes. So in order to do distributed computing, everybody has their favorite tool. We've adopted the Dirac tool set. So this is effectively a glue that holds everything together. Dirac is not only a workload management system, but it provides a lot of other interfaces, such as the data management system and catalog systems, etc. So this allows us to have a centralized system that orchestrates our distributed computing efforts, where you can see at the center you have the Dirac infrastructure, and then we have various resources. So at the bottom you have a Slurm site director for an HPC system, if you will, and you have cloud access, so we send jobs to clouds. And then we have all these other various types of resources that we can leverage. So looking at it in a slightly different view on slide 6, this is a tiered top-down view, if you will. What we have is what everybody has effectively is our sites where we have our clusters, our storage elements, and all our grid services, VOMS proxy, VOMS servers, FTS servers, etc. Then on top of that, of course, the glue that holds everything together is the rack, where we have various work management systems. But of course, like most experiments, we have to do things that are specialized to our experiment because we have things that are unique to our workflows. And so we have what's called a Belle Direct, which is an extension of the Direct framework that allows us to manage our data in the way we feel is appropriate and according to the policies of the experiment. One of the key efforts is what's called the DDMS, and I'll talk about that later on in my talk. And that's an effort that we've been doing here at PNNL. So moving to slide 7, what are the U.S. requirements? I limited it just to the U.S. to give a sense of why one would want to access HPC systems. So the idea here is if you look at the U.S. requirements, you can see that roughly about 50% of those requirements are actually Monte Carlo. And those we know can land on HPC systems quite nicely. So what the plan is for Belle 2 is that we're going to leverage that 50% and send it off to the LCFs across the U.S. And so there's another reason why you want to also investigate LCFs is because if you want to do really rare analyses, or if you want to do very complicated detector calibrations, one might want to take advantage of the scalability for doing large-scale deep learning applications. So those are other things that we're investigating within the Belle 2 collaboration. But just to give you a rough sense of the fractional, if we forget the rest of the table, but just look at the bottom table, you can see the rough fraction of what we consider CPU at PNL, which is really processing the raw data, versus the CPU that we could have at the LCFs. And you can see the dramatic difference that, in the upcoming years, the majority of our requirements are really LCF specific. We could really leverage those resources quite nicely. And then eventually they teeter off once the data gets significant. So in order to do a lot of our work at PNL, we have a slew of computing resources, and we really leverage the virtualization technologies, Kubernetes and OpenStack. And Kevin Fox, who gives a talk after me, will talk about exactly how we've been doing this. But this is a long laundry list of tools that are fairly common, and some of them are unique to our site. And so, again, I'll let Kevin speak to this, but nonetheless, there's quite a bit of work to do this virtualization that makes this quite easy and flexible for us to then test different ideas. In terms of using the HPC systems, we have allocations to NERSC, and we have 2 clusters, Edison and Cori. We've already used and we've tested, and we're now validated the whole system. So what you see in the right figure is essentially a peak where you can see that we just turned on the HPC system in terms of compute. It's a small window, but it nonetheless proves the point that the capabilities there. In fact, that's 15 kilohertz specs, and as I mentioned earlier on, roughly a normal amount of computing for a production like the one we have now is about 150. So that's like a 10% contribution to the overall computing, and we're not even touching the surface yet. So we're now just started MC9, and those numbers should grow quite quickly. They're running right now as we speak. So what we had to do here is there's a bit of clearly you cannot just use the HPC system out of the box, and we had to do some tricks. So I'm just going to quickly show some kind of box diagrams to give you a sense of the various components that go into using the NERSC system. In the rack framework, we have to actually create what we call a site director. What a site director is, effectively, is an agent that runs and submits jobs to whatever site you want it to send. We have to configure, of course, our resources to match this site director, and we actually have to map that resource to send the data to the appropriate location that has personified data. So that would be PNL in this instance. The next thing we have to do in the top right is we leveraged our existing Docker containers for our compute nodes, and then just synchronized the Belle 2 CVMFS repository, popped it in there, and then now we have a dedicated Docker for Belle 2 HPC. And of course, we keep track of that. Once we created our Docker, we put it into our Docker Hub. And then after that, we could pull it into either NERSC, or in fact, we could also pull it into Titan, which is a nice feature, because both of them use different versions. NERSC uses Shifter, and Titan uses Singularity. But nonetheless, once you've actually created your Docker, you're able to just push it to either one transparently. Once you have the Shifter at NERSC set up, you can then define the mount points that you want in your globus submit, and then you're good to go, and jobs will run. The other caveat is the user. You have to actually have a dedicated user that is associated to that allocation. So of course, the certificate that goes with the globus submit has to be an approved user, and it's obviously not the full collaboration. All right. So where are we at in terms of LCFs and our plans? So we have 1 million core hours allocated for this calendar year on NERSC. We're already set up to use Corey and Edison. We've created a new Docker that goes with our latest Monte Carlo campaign that is ongoing currently, just started again. One of the things we want to work on essentially is creating these MPI wrappers that will allow us to essentially submit a job to the NERSC system that requests lots of nodes, and then once you get onto those nodes, you can then spawn mini jobs, if you will. So that's the one wrapper that we want, so that we could kind of fill in the holes as the queue system thinks is most efficient. So if it's more efficient for us to submit a 10-node job than a single node job, then we should just do that. And so that's the work that we're going to do fairly soon. And then what we have to have is multiple site directors that actually have the different sizes to submit and keep track. In terms of the Oak Ridge Titan, what we have currently is only 1 million core hours. And what we have to develop, this is actually quite a different system than NERSC. It's a lot more complicated. You actually have no gateway. The worker nodes cannot talk to the outside world. So you have to play the trick of having, at the gateway, unpacking the pilot, getting the payload, having the payload in this environment, and then submitting, and then having the worker nodes understand where to grab the payload on the Lustre file system. So there's a lot of tricks to avoid for the fact that the worker nodes literally do not have access to anything. So you can use a Lustre file system to kind of circumnavigate those problems. So I'll quickly talk about the distributed data management system. As most people know, it's built of a lot of parts. So we have our Personar Mad Dash to keep track of our monitoring for networking. We have great FTP servers, FTS3 servers for doing the scheduling of the data transfers. And then we of course, use the rack, and then we build on top of the rack. So what you see here is a schematic diagram on slide 13 that illustrates the different layers of the Belle 2 extension for the data management system. At the first level, this is a service level. This is effectively the service API that people can actually communicate to make a request for a data operation. So a data operation could be really anything. It could be a transfer, a deletion. It could be if a job is scheduled to do something that needs that data sample, it needs to be registered here so that we avoid race conditions with whether you're racing something or not. So we have a localized system that takes in the requests and then puts it into the next layer that is the database layers that keeps track of the data operations. We also keep track of our replicas and our popularities in a separate database, and we also keep track of the storage elements in a separate system so that we can ensure that when we do make a transfer or something, that we've verified that that system is online and healthy. At the end, we have a bunch of agents that run on the back, on the server side, that allows us to do various executions, cleaning, so common data management operations. And finally, we leverage the Dirac base layer. In the interest of time, I'll try to go as quickly as possible. Here we have a large effort, of course, to deal with the networking, given that we have a large amounts of data coming from KAK. The accomplishments that are relevant were that we've actually joined the LHC1. And on top of that, we've done numerous network data challenges to test the various connectivities between the sites as they've been evolving. One of the biggest evolutions really was the upgrade of the SciNet 5 to SciNet 5. That's a trans-Pacific 100 gig link. So this, of course, was an important test to make sure that everything worked. We've been able to essentially saturate the existing nearly saturate the existing bandwidth, where we have 2 times 10 at PNNL, and we've hit about 16 out of a possible, theoretical max of 20. So the tests have been very productive to identify problems, and also have illustrated that we've been able to achieve all the goals that have been put forward by people like ESNet to make sure that we have the right numbers in terms of how much data we need to do to transfer all over the world. So I'm going to omit slide 15 in the interest of time, but this is essentially a matrix that gives a sense of where the network is. A lot of these numbers are actually now being updated, and we're currently doing a new Monte Carlo data challenge with some new sites that we have, and so we're excited to see these new sites, and some of them have amazing capacity, and we'd like to saturate them as soon as possible. So nonetheless, these are roughly the numbers, and you can see that KK to PNL, which is the raw data transfer link, is providing a nice 16 gigs, which is more than adequate for what is required for Belle 2. On top of actually just doing networking, people are probably familiar with the PerfStar and the Mad Dash. And so what we're doing right now is we're integrating the Mad Dash API. So we have a Mad Dash REST API. We have an agent that pulls the information from there and then puts into our database. That allows us to either monitor it on our own system, but it also allows us to now start doing active automated debugging of the sites. If we see drop packets somewhere, that's going to trigger some response. It also will trigger that we probably not send jobs transfers to that particular site, and maybe circumnavigate that particular link to avoid these problems. So this last slide is just a kind of a update and status and plans for the DDM. As of now, in the Monte Carlo campaigns, up to Monte Carlo campaign 9, we're able to do replication rates of about 20,000 jobs transfers per hour. We're able to delete at about a rate of 10,000 files per hour. And so the schematic, what you see here is a diagram that illustrates as a function of time the tasks that were deleted, and you can see that it grew significantly at the end of that time series, and that's effectively us introducing some multi-threading components to that so that we could augment the capability. Those requirements are getting close to the requirements for Belle 2. We're probably expecting about a couple factors more improvements, but these are numbers that are coming actually out of the production, so it's partially limited by the data rates. We've done some scalability tests. I don't have figures here, but I can show them if anybody's interested. Things that we're looking at in the near-term future is looking at populating the replicant popularity B specific, and we're also going to look into doing data forecasting and how we actually can leverage various networking tools to be able to forecast and send jobs to avoid contingencies between the storage and the compute elements. We're going to start tuning the multi-threaded agents. We need to streamline the Belle 2 Dirac infrastructure and the Dirac base code to have a better streamlined access to the FTS3 server. We need to finalize job locking for avoiding race conditions between the WMS and data transfers and deletions. And then finally, we need to finalize this network integration component. Thank you.
Thank you. impressive talk, but the question is why your replication rate is twice faster than deletion rate? Do you have an explanation for that?
Oh, yeah, sure. So they do quite different things. And so one of the key components that is different, well, the way it's currently implemented is when we get a data operation, we immediately fork out with transfers, and it goes to a separate system and goes to the FTS server. And so this has already been optimized. On the deletion side, it actually stays into the actual deletion component, and it stays in our execution, and it has to execute. We do a lot of sanity checks, and this has overheads that we're aware of. For example, we do checksums, but one of the things we do is somebody says they're deleting it. We want to make sure that, do we have another replica somewhere else? Things like that. Is the checksum of the one we think we're going to delete consistent with what's in the catalog? If it's not, we should actually make a request to transfer. So there's a whole bunch of logic there above and beyond just a simple transfer. And that's the current overhead.
Okay, thank you.
So I could actually speak to the point about if you wanted to adopt it. We at P&L have adopted it for currently 3 different other experiments, and we've been able to build it. Of course, we do this all the time. We have experience here, but it's a fairly quick process to get a direct server and do the WMS components, all that. It's not that much work anymore. In the past, it was much more difficult, but now you could do this fairly quickly. So like I said, we have 3 different experiments that are actually currently using it. One actually at UW, transferring data to PNNL, and then we process the data at PNNL. This was actually probably took me, the base infrastructure was, maybe a week. Yeah.